Imagine receiving a mysterious letter, written by an anonymous sender that suddenly changes everything you know about your past. A millionaire, living a life of luxury and solitude, finds himself at a crossroads when this letter arrives, revealing a long-lost family he never knew existed. What secrets lie within this message, and how will it lead him on a journey that changes not only his life, but the lives of those he thought he'd lost forever? Stay with us as we unravel this incredible story of lost connections, hope, and redemption. In the bustling city of New York, Alexander Carlisle lived a life that many could only dream of. He was the epitome of success, a self-made millionaire whose empire stretched across the globe, encompassing luxury hotels, high-end restaurants, and elite properties. Yet despite his wealth and accomplishments, there was an emptiness that haunted him, an unshakable void that no amount of money could fill. His days were filled with meetings, business deals, and endless demands. But at night, when the city lights twinkled outside his penthouse window, he found himself alone with his thoughts. Thoughts that always seemed to drift back to the past he couldn't quite remember. Alexander had grown up in foster care, moving from one home to another, never quite finding a place where he truly belonged. His memories of his early childhood were fragmented, hazy at best, and he had long since resigned himself to the fact that he might never know the truth about where he came from or who his family was. It was a part of his life that he had buried deep, focusing instead on building the future he wanted, one where he was in control, where he was powerful, where he would never have to feel vulnerable again. But that all changed one morning when a letter arrived at his office, a simple, unassuming envelope with no return address. It was placed on his desk by his assistant, who mentioned that it had been hand-delivered by someone who refused to give their name. Alexander frowned as he looked at the envelope, his curiosity piqued. It wasn't often that something so mysterious crossed his path, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of unease as he picked it up, his fingers brushing over the coarse paper. He opened the envelope carefully, his eyes scanning the handwritten note inside. The words were simple, but they hit him with the force of a tidal wave. You have family who never stopped looking for you. If you want answers, come to the address below. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest as he read the words again, his mind racing. Family. The very idea seemed impossible, yet something in the note, something in the way the words were written, struck a chord deep within him. He felt a surge of emotions, confusion, hope, fear, all swirling together, leaving him breathless. He had spent so many years convincing himself that he didn't need anyone, that he was better off alone. But now the possibility of finding the family he had lost, of discovering the truth about his past, was right in front of him. The address written on the note was unfamiliar, an old neighborhood on the outskirts of the city, a place that Alexander had never been to. He hesitated for a moment, his instincts telling him to ignore it, to toss the letter aside and continue with his life. But something held him back, a longing that he had buried deep, a desire to know where he truly came from, to understand who he was beyond the wealth and the success. He couldn't ignore it, not this time. That afternoon, Alexander found himself standing in front of a modest brick house, the kind that looked like it had seen better days but still held a sense of warmth and history. He took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he approached the front door. The neighborhood was quiet, the kind of place where children played on the sidewalks and neighbors knew each other by name. It was a far cry from the world of luxury and opulence that Alexander was used to, but there was something comforting about it, something that made him feel strangely at ease. He knocked on the door, his hands trembling slightly as he waited. A moment later, the door creaked open and an elderly woman appeared, her eyes widening in surprise as she looked at him. She was small, her face lined with age, but there was a warmth in her eyes that made Alexander's heart ache. She studied him for a moment, her gaze softening as she spoke. "Alexander?" she said, her voice barely above a whisper, as if she couldn't quite believe what she was seeing. Alexander felt his breath catch, his mind racing. "Yes," he replied, his voice trembling. I got a letter." The woman's eyes filled with tears, her lips trembling as she stepped forward, her hand reaching out to touch his arm. "Oh, my dear boy," she whispered, her voice breaking. "We never stopped looking for you." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat, his emotions overwhelming him as he looked at her. He had spent so many years feeling alone, feeling like he had no one. And now, standing in front of this woman who seemed to know him, who seemed to care for him, he felt something inside him begin to crack. He swallowed hard, his eyes glistening with tears as he spoke. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice barely audible. The woman smiled, her eyes filled with love. "I'm your grandmother," she said softly, "and I've waited so long for this day." Alexander felt his heart swell, a mixture of disbelief and hope filling him as he looked at her. He had never imagined that he would find himself here, that he would be standing on the doorstep of a home he had never known, meeting a family he had thought was lost to him forever. But as he looked into his grandmother's eyes, he knew that this was where he was meant to be, that this was the beginning of a journey that would change everything. She stepped aside, gesturing for him to come inside, her eyes filled with tears of joy. "There's so much you need to know," she said softly. "So much we need to tell you." Alexander took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest as he stepped inside, the door closing behind him. The house was warm, filled with the scent of freshly baked bread and the sound of soft music playing in the background. It was a home, a real home, something that Alexander had never truly known. And as he looked around, taking in the photographs on the walls, the worn but comfortable furniture, he felt a sense of peace settle over him. His grandmother led him to the living room, her hand resting on his arm as she guided him to a seat. She sat beside him, her eyes filled with warmth as she began to speak, her voice soft and filled with emotion. She told him about his parents, about the family that had searched for him for years, never giving up hope that they would one day find him. She spoke of the circumstances that had led to their separation, of the choices that had been made, and of the pain they had all endured. Alexander listened, his heart aching as he heard the story of his past, a story that was filled with love, with loss, and with hope. He learned about his parents, about their love for him, and about the tragedy that had torn them apart. He learned about the years his grandmother had spent searching for him, never giving up hope that they would one day be reunited. And as he listened, he felt a sense of belonging that he had never known before, a sense that he was finally home. Tears filled his eyes as his grandmother reached out, her hand resting on his cheek. "You're not alone anymore, Alexander," she whispered, her voice filled with love. "You have a family now. You have us." Alexander felt the tears spill over, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked at her. For so long he had believed that he was alone, that he had no one. But now, as he sat in this warm, welcoming home, surrounded by the love of a family he had never known, he realized that he had been wrong. He wasn't alone. Not anymore. He had found his family, and with them he had found a sense of peace, of belonging, that he had been searching for his entire life. The initial days after reuniting with his grandmother were a whirlwind of emotions for Alexander. The warmth of her embrace, the softness in her voice, and the love that radiated from her made him feel something he hadn't experienced in years. Comfort. It was as if for the first time the walls that he had built around himself were starting to crumble. He began to visit the modest house on the outskirts of the city more frequently, learning more about his past, discovering stories about his parents, and connecting with the memories that had been hidden from him for so long. But as Alexander began to open up to the idea of family, the complexities of his newfound connections also started to surface. It wasn't just about meeting his grandmother. He discovered that he had an uncle, Raymond, who lived a few towns over. Raymond had been the one leading the search for Alexander all these years, never giving up hope that they would one day find him. When Alexander met Raymond for the first time, it was an emotional moment, filled with tears and long embraces. Raymond welcomed Alexander into his home with open arms, showing him pictures of his parents and telling stories about his childhood. Raymond was a warm and caring man, but it was clear that he had also faced his share of struggles. He had lost his job a few years ago and had been struggling to make ends meet ever since. Despite his own hardships, Raymond had never stopped looking for Alexander. and his determination had eventually led to the mysterious letter that found its way to Alexander's office. The more time Alexander spent with his family, the more he realized just how much they had gone through, how much they had sacrificed to try and bring him back into their lives. One evening, as they sat in Raymond's living room, the two of them sharing a bottle of whiskey, Raymond looked at Alexander with a seriousness that he hadn't seen before. His eyes, usually filled with warmth, were now clouded with something darker. Worry. "Alex," Raymond began, his voice low. "There's something I need to talk to you about. Something I've been holding off on because, well, I didn't want to overwhelm you." Alexander frowned, setting his glass down on the coffee table. "What is it?" he asked, his heart pounding in his chest. Raymond took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the photographs on the wall, pictures of their family, of happier times. "There are people who didn't want us to find you," he said slowly. "People who have their own reasons for keeping you away from us." Alexander's brow furrowed, confusion washing over him. "What do you mean?" he asked, his voice tinged with disbelief. Raymond sighed, his shoulders slumping as he looked at Alexander. "Your parents, they were involved in something dangerous. When they passed, I tried to protect you, tried to keep you safe, but there were others who had different plans. They didn't want you to know the truth, and they didn't want you to be a part of this family." Alexander felt a chill run down his spine, his heart pounding in his chest as he processed Raymond's words. "Who are these people?" he asked, his voice trembling. Raymond hesitated for a moment, his gaze meeting Alexander's, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "They were business partners of your father," he said quietly, "powerful people who were involved in some questionable activities. Your father wanted out. He wanted to protect you and your mother. But when he tried to leave, things went south. After the accident, they made sure that you were kept away from us. They didn't want you digging into the past, finding out things that could cause problems for them." Alexander felt his breath catch, his mind racing as he tried to make sense of what Raymond was saying. He had always known that his past was complicated, but he had never imagined that it was something like this. Something filled with danger, with secrets that others had tried to keep hidden. He felt a surge of anger, his jaw clenching as he looked at Raymond. "Why didn't you tell me this sooner?" he asked, his voice tight. Raymond looked down, his expression pained. "I wanted to," he said softly. "But I didn't want to scare you off. I thought maybe we could just be a family without all of this hanging over us. But now that you're here, I realize that you deserve to know the truth. You deserve to know what you're up against." Alexander was silent for a long moment, his mind racing as he processed everything Raymond had said. He felt a mixture of emotions, anger, fear, and a deep sense of betrayal. He had spent his entire life trying to build something for himself, trying to create a life where he was in control, and now he was being told that there were forces beyond his understanding that had been pulling the strings all along. He took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Raymond's, his voice filled with determination. "I'm not running," he said firmly. "I'm not going to let them scare me away. This is my family, and I'm not going to let anyone take that away from me." Raymond nodded, his eyes filled with a mixture of pride and worry. "I knew you'd say that," he said softly. "But you need to be careful, Alex. These people, they're dangerous. They won't hesitate to do whatever it takes to protect themselves." Alexander clenched his jaw, his eyes filled with resolve. "Let them come," he said quietly. "I've faced challenges before, and I'm not afraid of them. I'm not going to let anyone keep me from my family." The following weeks were filled with a growing sense of unease. Alexander tried to focus on getting to know his family, on building the connections that he had been missing for so long, but the shadow of the past loomed over them. He could see the worry in his grandmother's eyes, the way she would glance over her shoulder when they were out in public, her hands trembling slightly whenever they received an unexpected visitor. Raymond, too, seemed on edge, his eyes constantly scanning their surroundings. His voice filled with tension whenever he spoke of the past. Despite the fear that seemed to hang over them, Alexander refused to let it deter him. He spent his days with his grandmother, helping her around the house, listening to her stories, and learning about the family he had lost. He learned about his mother, about her kindness, her love for music, and the way she would sing to him when he was a baby. He learned about his father, about his dreams of building a life for their family, of leaving behind the dangerous world he had once been a part of. And with each story, Alexander felt a deeper connection to the family he had never known, a sense of belonging that he had spent his entire life searching for. But the threat was never far from his mind. One evening, as Alexander was leaving his grandmother's house, he noticed a black car parked down the street, its windows tinted, the engine idling quietly. A chill ran down his spine as he watched it, his instincts telling him that something was wrong. He took a deep breath, his eyes narrowing as he made his way to his own car, his heart pounding in his chest. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the people Raymond had warned him about were closer than he had realized. The next day, Alexander decided that he couldn't just sit back and wait for something to happen. He needed to take action, to protect his family, to ensure that they were safe. He reached out to a private investigator, someone he had worked with in the past, someone he knew he could trust. He told the investigator everything, about the letter, about the reunion with his family, about the threats that loomed over them. The investigator listened carefully, his expression serious as he took notes, his eyes filled with concern. "I'll look into it, Alex," he said, his voice steady. "But you need to be careful. If these people are as powerful as you say, they won't take kindly to anyone digging into their business." Alexander nodded, his jaw clenched. "I don't care," he said firmly. "I'm not going to let them intimidate me. I need to know what we're dealing with, and I need to protect my family." The investigator gave a small nod, his eyes filled with respect. "I'll do what I can," he said, "but just know that once we start down this path, there's no turning back." Alexander took a deep breath, his eyes filled with determination. "I'm ready," he said quietly. "Whatever it takes, I'm ready." Days turned into weeks, and the tension only seemed to grow. The private investigator had uncovered some information, names, connections, business dealings that tied back to Alexander's father and his former associates. It was clear that these people were powerful, that they had influence in places that Alexander hadn't even imagined. The more he learned, the more he realized just how dangerous the situation was, and just how far these people would go to protect their secrets. One evening, as Alexander sat in his penthouse, the city lights twinkling outside the window, he received a call from the investigator. The voice on the other end was tense, filled with urgency. "Alex, you need to get out of there," the investigator said, his voice low. "I've been following a lead and I think they know we're onto them. I'm seeing movement, people watching your building. You need to leave now." Alexander felt his heart pound in his chest, his mind racing as he processed the investigator's words. He stood, his eyes scanning the room, his instincts kicking in. He couldn't let these people get to him. Not when he had finally found his family, not when he had so much to lose. He grabbed his keys, his heart pounding as he made his way to the door. He knew that he had to protect himself, that he had to protect his family, no matter what. And as he stepped into the elevator, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead, he knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going to let anyone take away the life he had fought so hard to build. Alexander drove through the darkened streets of New York, his mind racing as he tried to process everything that had happened in the last few hours. The warning from the private investigator still echoed in his ears. People were watching him, tracking his movements, and he knew that his life was no longer safe. He couldn't afford to stay in his penthouse. It was too exposed, too vulnerable. He needed to protect himself, and more importantly, he needed to protect his newfound family. As he sped through the city, he made a decision. He would go to his grandmother's house. It was the only place where he felt he could be safe, where he knew he could be surrounded by people who cared for him. He had spent so many years alone, relying on no one but himself, but now, he realized that he couldn't do this on his own. He needed his family, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect them. The night was eerily quiet as Alexander pulled up in front of his grandmother's house. The streetlights cast long shadows across the pavement, and the house itself seemed to glow softly in the darkness, a beacon of warmth and safety amidst the uncertainty that surrounded him. He stepped out of the car, his eyes scanning the street, his senses on high alert. He could feel the tension in the air, the weight of the danger that loomed over him, but he pushed it aside as he approached the front door. He knocked softly, his heart pounding in his chest as he waited. A moment later, the door opened and his grandmother appeared, her eyes widening in surprise as she saw him standing there. "Alexander?" she said, her voice filled with concern. "What are you doing here? It's so late." Alexander swallowed hard, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "I need to talk to you, Grandma," he said, his voice trembling. "It's important." She studied him for a moment, her brow furrowing in worry, and then she stepped aside, gesturing for him to come inside. "Of course, my dear," she said softly. "Come in." Alexander stepped into the house, the familiar warmth and comfort washing over him as he entered the living room. His grandmother closed the door behind him, her eyes never leaving his face as she led him to the couch. She sat down beside him, her hand resting gently on his arm. "What's going on, Alexander?" she asked, her voice filled with concern. "You look like you've seen a ghost." Alexander took a deep breath, his eyes meeting hers, his heart pounding in his chest. "It's about Dad," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "And the people he was involved with. They know about me, Grandma. They know that I've been digging into the past and they're coming after me." His grandmother's face paled, her eyes widening in shock. "Oh, Alexander," she whispered, her voice trembling. "I was afraid this would happen. Your father, he tried so hard to protect you from all of this. He wanted you to have a normal life, away from all the danger." Alexander clenched his jaw, his eyes filled with determination. "I know, Grandma," he said, his voice steady. "But I can't run from this. I need to protect you, and I need to protect Raymond. I can't let these people hurt us." His grandmother looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and love. "You're so much like your father," she said softly, her voice filled with emotion. "He was always so determined to do the right thing, no matter the cost. But Alexander, these people, they're dangerous. They won't stop until they get what they want." Alexander nodded, his eyes filled with resolve. "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm not going to let them win. I'm not going to let them take away the family I just found." His grandmother reached out, her hand resting on his cheek, her eyes glistening with tears. "You're not alone, Alexander," she said softly. "We're in this together. Whatever happens, we'll face it as a family." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat, his heart swelling with emotion as he looked at her. He had spent so many years feeling alone, feeling like he had no one. And now, sitting here with his grandmother, he realized that he wasn't alone, not anymore. He had a family, and he was willing to do whatever it took to protect them. The following morning, Alexander woke to the sound of voices coming from the kitchen. He rubbed his eyes, the events of the previous night rushing back to him as he sat up, his heart pounding in his chest. He made his way to the kitchen, the smell of freshly brewed coffee filling the air as he entered the room. His grandmother was standing by the stove, her back to him, while Raymond sat at the kitchen table, his face drawn, his eyes filled with worry. Alexander could see the tension in the room, the way his grandmother's hands shook slightly as she poured coffee into a mug, the way Raymond's gaze was fixed on the table in front of him. Raymond looked up as Alexander entered, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and determination. "Alex," he said, his voice low. "We need to talk." Alexander nodded, his jaw clenched as he took a seat at the table. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice steady despite the fear that gnawed at him. Raymond took a deep breath, his gaze meeting Alexander's. "I've been doing some thinking," he said slowly. About everything. About Dad. About the people who are after us. And I think there's more to this than we realize. Alexander frowned, his eyes narrowing. What do you mean? He asked. Raymond hesitated for a moment, his gaze shifting to their grandmother, who had turned to face them, her eyes filled with worry. I think there's something that Dad left behind, he said quietly. Something that these people are after. I don't know what it is, but I have a feeling that it's the key to everything. Alexander felt his heart pound in his chest, his mind racing as he processed Raymond's words. Do you have any idea where it might be? He asked, his voice filled with urgency. Raymond shook his head, his expression pained. No, he said softly. But I think it's connected to the house, the old family home where we used to live before everything happened. Alexander took a deep breath, his eyes filled with determination. Then that's where we need to go, he said firmly. We need to find whatever it is that Dad left behind, and we need to put an end to this. His grandmother's face paled, her eyes widening in fear. Alexander, no, she said, her voice trembling. That house, it's dangerous. They'll be watching it. If you go there, you'll be putting yourself in harm's way. Alexander looked at her, his eyes filled with love and determination. I have to do this, Grandma, he said softly. I can't keep running. I need to find out the truth, and I need to protect all of you. His grandmother was silent for a long moment, her eyes glistening with tears as she looked at him. Finally, she gave a small nod, her shoulders slumping in defeat. Just promise me you'll be careful, she whispered, her voice filled with emotion. Promise me you'll come back to us. Alexander reached out, his hand resting on hers, his eyes filled with love. I promise, he said softly. I'm not going anywhere. Later that day, Alexander and Raymond set out for the old family home, a place that held so many memories, both good and bad. It had been years since anyone had set foot in the house, and as they pulled up in front of it, Alexander felt a sense of unease settle over him. The house was old, its once vibrant paint now faded and peeling, the windows dark and empty. It looked abandoned, forgotten, and yet there was something about it that made Alexander's heart ache, a sense of loss, of what could have been. Raymond glanced at Alexander, his expression filled with a mixture of determination and fear. You ready for this? He asked, his voice low. Alexander nodded, his jaw clenched. Let's do it, he said, his voice steady. They made their way to the front door, the air heavy with tension as Raymond fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling slightly. The door creaked open, revealing the dark, empty interior of the house. Alexander took a deep breath, his eyes scanning the room as they stepped inside. The air was stale, the furniture covered in dust, and yet there was something familiar about it, something that made Alexander feel a sense of connection to the past. They moved through the house in silence, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Raymond led the way, his eyes scanning the rooms, his expression tense. Dad used to have a study, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. It's where he kept all his important documents. If there's anything here, that's where it'll be. Alexander followed Raymond down the hallway, his heart pounding in his chest as they approached the door to the study. Raymond pushed it open, the door creaking on its hinges as they stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the window, which was partially covered by a tattered curtain. The desk was covered in papers, old notebooks and photographs, and Alexander felt a sense of nostalgia wash over him as he looked at them. Raymond began to search through the papers, his hands moving quickly as he sorted through the clutter. Alexander moved to the bookshelf, his eyes scanning the titles, his fingers brushing over the spines of the books. He paused as he noticed something, a small leather-bound journal tucked away on the top shelf. He reached up, pulling it down, his heart pounding as he opened it. The pages were filled with his father's handwriting, notes, sketches, names. Alexander felt his breath catch as he scanned the pages, his eyes widening as he realized what he was holding. It was a record, a record of everything his father had been involved in, every deal, every connection, every secret. It was the key to everything, the proof that could bring down the people who had been after them for so long. "Raymond," Alexander said, his voice trembling. "I think I found it." Raymond looked up, his eyes widening as he saw the journal in Alexander's hands. He stepped closer, his gaze scanning the pages, his expression filled with a mixture of awe and fear. "This is it," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "This is what they've been looking for." Alexander nodded, his heart pounding in his chest. "We need to get this to the authorities," he said, his voice filled with determination. "This is the proof we need to bring them down." But before they could move, they heard it. The sound of footsteps approaching, the creak of the floorboards. Alexander's heart froze, his eyes meeting Raymond's, a sense of dread washing over him. "They're here," Raymond whispered, his voice filled with fear. Alexander clenched his jaw, his eyes filled with resolve. "We have to get out of here," he said, his voice steady. "We can't let them get this journal." Raymond nodded, his eyes filled with determination as they turned towards the door. They moved quickly, their hearts pounding in their chests as they made their way through the house, the sound of footsteps growing louder behind them. Alexander could feel the adrenaline coursing through his veins, his mind racing as they reached the front door. They burst through the door, the cold night air hitting them as they ran towards the car. Alexander could hear the sound of voices behind them, the shouts of the men who were chasing them, but he didn't look back. He knew that they had to keep moving, that they couldn't let these people catch them, not when they were so close to finally finding the truth. Raymond fumbled with the keys, his hands trembling as he unlocked the car. They jumped inside, Alexander's heart pounding as he started the engine, the tires screeching as they sped away. He could see the headlights of another car behind them, the men still chasing them, and he knew that they were in for the fight of their lives. But as they drove through the darkened streets, the journal clutched tightly in Alexander's hands. He felt a sense of hope. A hope that they could finally put an end to this, that they could finally be free. And he knew that no matter what happened, he wasn't going to give up. He was going to fight for his family, for the truth, for the future that they all deserved. The car sped through the darkened streets, the roar of the engine echoing through the empty night. Alexander gripped the steering wheel tightly, his eyes focused on the road ahead, his heart pounding in his chest. Beside him, Raymond clung to the dashboard, his eyes wide with fear as he glanced behind them. The headlights of their pursuers still visible in the distance. The journal, his father's journal, was clutched tightly in Alexander's lap, the weight of its secrets pressing down on him. They drove for what felt like hours, the tension in the car palpable, the fear of what lay behind them pushing them forward. Alexander's mind raced as he tried to come up with a plan, a way to get out of this mess, a way to keep his family safe. He knew that they couldn't keep running forever, that eventually they would have to face the people who were after them. But for now, all that mattered was getting away, finding a safe place to regroup and figure out their next move. Finally, they reached the outskirts of the city, the lights of New York fading into the distance as they turned onto a winding country road. The darkness of the night enveloped them, the trees lining the road casting long shadows across the pavement. Alexander glanced in the rearview mirror, his heart pounding as he saw the headlights of the car behind them disappear from view. He let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders slumping in relief. "I think we lost them," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Raymond nodded, his eyes still filled with worry. "For now," he said, his voice trembling. "But they'll keep coming, Alex. They won't stop until they get what they want." Alexander clenched his jaw, his eyes filled with determination. "Then we'll just have to make sure they don't get it," he said, his voice steady. "We're going to figure this out, Ray. We're going to put an end to this." Raymond looked at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "How?" he asked, his voice barely audible. "How are we supposed to fight people like this? They have power, influence. We're just two guys trying to stay alive." Alexander took a deep breath, his gaze shifting to the road ahead. "We're not alone," he said softly. "We have each other. We have Grandma. And we have the truth that's more than they have." Raymond was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying Alexander's face, and then he gave a small nod, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "You're right," he said, his voice filled with determination. "We're not alone, and we're not going to let them win." The sun was just beginning to rise as Alexander and Raymond pulled up in front of an old farmhouse, its wooden exterior weathered and worn, the paint peeling in places. It was a place that Raymond had remembered, a safe house of sorts, owned by an old friend who had once helped their father. It was isolated, far from the city, and more importantly, it was off the grid. It was the kind of place where they could lay low, regroup, and figure out their next move. They stepped out of the car, the cold morning air biting at their skin as they made their way to the front door. Raymond knocked softly, his hands trembling slightly as they waited. A moment later, the door creaked open, revealing an older man, his face lined with age, his eyes widening in surprise as he saw them standing there. "Ray?" the man said, his voice filled with disbelief. "What are you doing here?" Raymond managed a small smile, his eyes filled with a mixture of relief and exhaustion. "We need your help, Frank," he said softly. "We're in some trouble, and we don't have anywhere else to go." Frank studied them for a moment, his gaze shifting to Alexander, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're Henry's boy, aren't you?" he asked, his voice filled with curiosity. Alexander nodded, his heart swelling with emotion at the mention of his father's name. "Yes," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm Alexander." Frank's expression softened, his eyes filled with a mixture of sadness and warmth. "Your father was a good man," he said quietly. "Come in. Let's get you both settled." They stepped inside, the warmth of the farmhouse wrapping around them as Frank led them to the living room. The house was simple, the furniture old but comfortable, the walls lined with photographs of Frank's family. It was a stark contrast to the opulence of Alexander's penthouse, but there was something comforting about it, something that made Alexander feel at ease. Frank gestured for them to sit, his eyes filled with concern as he looked at them. "Now tell me what's going on," he said, his voice steady. "What kind of trouble are you in?" Raymond took a deep breath, his eyes meeting Frank's. "It's about Henry," he said softly, "and the people he was involved with. They're after us, Frank. They don't want us to know the truth." Frank frowned, his brow furrowing as he listened. "The truth?" he asked, his voice filled with confusion. "What truth?" Alexander reached into his bag, pulling out the leather-bound journal, his hands trembling slightly as he held it out to Frank. "This," he said, his voice filled with emotion. "It's my father's journal. It has everything, every deal, every connection, every secret. It's the proof we need to bring them down." Frank took the journal, his eyes scanning the pages, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "This is dangerous stuff," he said quietly, his voice filled. "These people, they're not going to stop until they get this." Alexander nodded, his eyes filled with determination. "I know," he said softly, "but we can't let them win. We need to find a way to get this to the authorities, to make sure that they're held accountable for what they've done." Frank was silent for a long moment, his eyes studying Alexander's face, and then he gave a small nod, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "All right," he said, his voice filled with determination. "I'll help you, but we need to be careful. These people have eyes everywhere." Raymond let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his shoulders slumping in relief. "Thank you, Frank," he said softly. "We don't know what we'd do without you." Frank gave a small smile, his eyes filled with warmth. "You're family, Ray," he said gently. "And family takes care of each other." The next few days were a blur of planning and preparation. Frank had connections, people he trusted, people who could help them get the journal to the right hands without drawing too much attention. Alexander and Raymond spent hours going over the details, working with Frank to come up with a plan that would keep them safe while ensuring that the truth would come to light. Alexander found himself spending a lot of time thinking about his father, about the sacrifices he had made, the choices that had led to this moment. He had always known that his father was a good man, but now, as he read through the pages of the journal, he realized just how much his father had given up to protect him. It was a sobering thought, and it filled him with a sense of responsibility, a determination to see this through, no matter the cost. One evening, as they sat around the kitchen table, the journal spread out in front of them. Frank looked at Alexander, his eyes filled with curiosity. "You know, your father used to talk about you all the time," he said softly. "He was so proud of you. He wanted nothing more than for you to have a better life, away from all of this." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat, his eyes glistening with tears as he looked at Frank. "I wish I could have known him better," he said quietly. "I wish I could have told him how much he means to me." Frank gave a small nod, his eyes filled with understanding. "I think he knew, Alex," he said gently. "He loved you more than anything, and he would be so proud of the man you've become." Alexander felt a sense of warmth wash over him, a feeling of peace that he hadn't felt in a long time. He knew that the road ahead would still be filled with challenges, that there would be moments of fear and uncertainty, but he also knew that he wasn't alone, that he had his family, that he had people who loved him, who believed in him, and that was enough. The day finally came when they were ready to put their plan into action. Frank had arranged for a trusted contact to meet them in a nearby town, a journalist who had connections with the authorities, someone who could help ensure that the information in the journal would be used to bring down the people who had been hunting them. It was a risky move, but it was their best chance at ending this once and for all. Alexander, Raymond, and Frank set out early in the morning, the sun just beginning to rise as they drove through the countryside. The tension in the car was palpable, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on them. Alexander could feel his heart pounding in his chest, his mind racing with thoughts of what lay ahead. He knew that this was their only chance, that they had to succeed. There was no other option. They arrived at the meeting spot, a small diner on the outskirts of town, just as the sun was fully rising, casting a golden glow over the landscape. The diner was nearly empty, the only sounds the clinking of dishes and the low murmur of conversation. They took a seat at a booth near the back, their eyes scanning the room, their senses on high alert. A few minutes later, a man entered the diner, a tall, thin figure with sharp features and a serious expression. He made his way over to their booth, his eyes meeting Frank's as he gave a small nod. "Frank?" he asked, his voice low. Frank stood, extending his hand. "James," he said, his voice filled with relief. "Thank you for coming." James nodded, his gaze shifting to Alexander and Raymond, his eyes filled with curiosity. "You must be Henry's family," he said softly. "Frank told me a lot about you." Alexander nodded, his jaw clenched. "Thank you for helping us," he said, his voice filled with gratitude. James gave a small smile, his eyes filled with determination. "Let's get this done," he said, his voice steady. "We don't have much time." Frank handed James the journal, his hands trembling slightly as he did so. James took it, his eyes scanning the pages, his expression growing more serious with each passing moment. "This is going to make a lot of people nervous," he said quietly, "but it's the right thing to do." Alexander felt a sense of hope swell in his chest, his eyes meeting James's. "That's all that matters," he said softly. "We just want the truth to come out." James nodded, his eyes filled with respect. "I'll make sure it does," he said firmly. "You have my word." As they left the diner, Alexander felt a sense of relief wash over him, a feeling that, for the first time in a long time, they were finally on the right path. They had taken a risk, but it was a risk worth taking. They had fought for the truth, for their family, for the future that they all deserved. And now, as they drove back to the farmhouse, the sun shining brightly overhead, Alexander knew that they had made the right choice. They still had a long way to go. There would still be challenges to face, battles to fight. But they were ready. They had each other, they had the truth, and they had the determination to see this through. And that, Alexander realized, was all they needed. He glanced over at Raymond, who was sitting beside him, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and hope. "We did it, Ray," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "We're going to be okay." Raymond looked at him, his eyes glistening with tears, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah," he said quietly, "we're going to be okay." And as they drove through the countryside, the road stretching out before them, Alexander knew that they had faced the darkness together, and they had come out stronger on the other side. They had fought for their family, for the truth, and for each other. And now as they looked towards the future, they knew that they could face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. After delivering the journal to James, Alexander, Raymond, and Frank returned to the farmhouse, hoping that the worst was behind them. But their sense of hope quickly turned into a gnawing tension. Before the sun fully disappeared over the horizon, they noticed an unfamiliar car parked down the road, not far from the house. The air grew heavy, a clear sign that danger was imminent. The threat they had hoped to escape had found them. Inside the farmhouse, they quickly formulated a plan. Frank suggested using the back route through the woods to disappear before being reached. However, Alexander knew that running meant living a life in fear, always looking over their shoulders. He was tired of running. With the truth in their hands, it was time to face the enemy, for the sake of his family, and to ensure justice. Raymond nodded in agreement, though fear was evident in his eyes. He knew this might be the last stand they ever made, but they couldn't back down now. Frank, despite his age, displayed unwavering determination, handing Alexander and Raymond 2 old hunting rifles. The guns weren't ideal, but they could buy them some time. The 3 men positioned themselves around the house, each taking up strategic positions as twilight gave way to the deep shadows of night. Minutes later, the sound of approaching footsteps became clear. Alexander peered out through a window and saw 3 men emerging from the car, dressed in black, moving with precision. These were professionals. They knew exactly what they were doing, and Alexander could sense that these men hadn't come to negotiate. They had come to finish what had been started. Alexander's heart pounded in his chest. He exchanged a look with Raymond, who was hidden behind a table in the hallway, and then with Frank, who was positioned near the fireplace. This was it, the moment they had dreaded but were prepared for. One of the men pounded forcefully on the door, the sound echoing through the empty house. "We know you're in there. Hand over what we want and nobody gets hurt," one of them shouted, his voice calm yet menacing. Alexander knew surrender wasn't an option. They had to protect the journal no matter what. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his trembling hands, and shouted back, "You're not getting anything from us. Walk away while you still can." For a moment there was silence. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted, the men outside opening fire. Alexander instinctively ducked, covering his head as bullets tore through the wooden door and shattered windows. The adrenaline surged through his body, and he knew they had to fight back if they wanted to make it through this alive. Frank, on the other side of the room, fired the first shot, the deafening crack of the rifle reverberating through the house. One of the men cried out, and Alexander heard hurried footsteps indicating that at least for now, they were hesitating. Raymond seized the moment, opening fire as well, his hands shaking, but his gaze resolute. Alexander moved along the side of the house, aiming through a broken window and firing towards the attacker's car, hoping to push them back further. Seconds seemed to stretch into hours as the gunfight continued, each shot echoing through their bodies, a stark reminder of how close they were to losing everything. The attackers regrouped, and Alexander knew that their next move would be even more aggressive. He moved closer to Frank, shouting over the sound of gunfire, "We need an exit plan. We can't stay here and let them corner us." Frank nodded, pointing towards the back exit. "Through the woods to the creek, we can lose them there," he shouted back. Raymond joined them, his face pale but determined. "We need a distraction. If they realize we're running, they'll chase us through the woods." Alexander knew Raymond was right. They needed something to divert attention. His eyes darted around until they landed on a gasoline canister near the fireplace. A risky, dangerous idea began to form in his mind. He pointed to the canister and looked at Frank. "We can set the barn on fire. Make them think we're hiding there. It might buy us some time." Frank hesitated for a moment, then nodded. "It's risky, but it might work," he said. He grabbed the canister and the three of them moved quickly towards the back door, taking whatever they could carry, including the journal. When they stepped outside, the cold night air enveloped them and they moved in the shadows towards the barn. Frank poured the gasoline along the sides of the barn as Raymond kept watch, rifle in hand. Alexander struck a match, his hand shaking, and threw it onto the gasoline. Flames quickly roared to life, lighting up the night sky with a brilliant orange glow. The heat was intense, and Alexander knew there was no turning back now. They ran towards the woods, their hearts pounding as the flames consumed the barn, shadows dancing wildly on the ground as they fled. They heard the men shouting, running towards the blaze, and Alexander knew they only had moments before the attackers realized they had been tricked. The three moved swiftly through the woods, their feet crunching leaves and snapping twigs as they approached the creek. The air was cold, their breath visible in the night, but they couldn't stop. Alexander clutched the journal tightly to his chest, his eyes filled with determination. They had to survive. They had to make sure that everything his father had fought to protect wasn't lost. They reached the creek and waded into the water, moving along its course to avoid leaving tracks. Frank led the way, his familiarity with the terrain ensuring they wouldn't get lost in the darkness. Raymond followed closely, helping Alexander keep pace. Eventually, when the moon was high in the sky and the sounds of pursuit had finally faded, the three of them stopped, breathing heavily. Alexander looked at his companions, relief beginning to mix with exhaustion. They had escaped, for now. Frank turned to Alexander, his eyes filled with determination. "We need to keep moving. We're not out of danger yet. But we did something important tonight. We showed them we won't be intimidated." Raymond nodded, his eyes filled with respect as he looked at Allie. "We're in this together, Alex. We're going to see this through no matter what it takes." Alexander felt the weight of the journal in his hands and knew that this battle wasn't over yet. They had faced the darkness and survived. But the true fight was just beginning. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together, determined to protect the truth and, above all, each other. The following morning, Alexander, Raymond, and Frank continued their journey through the woods, the rising sun casting a golden light over the landscape. The tension from the previous night still weighed heavily on them, but there was also a sense of accomplishment, a feeling that they had faced the danger head-on and lived to see another day. They were battered, exhausted, but still standing, and that was all that mattered. As they reached a clearing, they took a moment to rest, sitting on fallen logs by the edge of the creek. The forest was quiet, the only sound the gentle rustle of leaves in the wind. It was a stark contrast to the chaos of the night before, and Alexander found himself taking deep breaths, letting the peace of the morning wash over him. Raymond turned to Alexander, his expression a mix of exhaustion and gratitude. "We made it, Alex," he said quietly. "I can't believe we actually made it." Alexander looked down at the journal, the worn leather cover still damp from the creek. He nodded, his gaze shifting to Raymond, a small smile tugging at his lips. "We did," he said, his voice steady. "But we still have work to do. This journal, it needs to get to the right people. We can't let everything we've been through be for nothing." Frank, who had been silent, looked up at them, his eyes filled with determination. "I have a contact, a journalist who works with a major publication. She's been trying to uncover corruption in the business world for years. If anyone can help us, it's her," he said. Raymond gave a nod of agreement. "That's our next step then. We get this journal to her, and we make sure the truth comes out." Alexander felt a sense of purpose settle over him, a clarity that had been missing for so long. They had a plan, a way forward, and that was all they needed. He looked at his uncle and Frank, his heart swelling with gratitude. They had stood by him, fought beside him, and now they were closer to achieving what they had set out to do. 2 days later, they arrived at a small town where Frank's contact, the journalist, was waiting. Her name was Linda, a sharp-eyed woman in her late 30s who exuded confidence and tenacity. She greeted them with a firm handshake, her eyes immediately falling to the journal in Alexander's hands. "Is this what I've been waiting for?" she asked, her voice filled with curiosity and a hint of excitement. Alexander nodded, handing her the journal. "This is everything my father documented, every deal, every connection. It's enough to expose the people who have been after us." Linda carefully flipped through the journal, her eyes widening as she scanned the pages. "This is incredible," she said, her voice a mix of awe and determination. "If what's in here is true, this could bring down some powerful people. But you need to understand, going public with this won't be easy. These people won't just sit back and let this happen." Alexander exchanged a glance with Raymond and Frank, then looked back at Linda. "We know," he said firmly, "but we're not backing down. We need the truth to come out, no matter what it takes." Linda smiled, a glimmer of respect in her eyes. "I can see why your father was proud of you," she said softly. "I'll do everything I can to make sure this story gets told." She took the journal, carefully placing it in her bag. She then looked back at them, her expression serious. "You should stay out of sight for a while. Once this hits the press, things are going to get dangerous." Frank nodded, his expression grim. "We have a place where we can lay low," he said. "We'll be careful." Alexander felt a mixture of emotions: relief, fear, hope. They were handing over the evidence, trusting that Linda would bring the truth to light. It was a leap of faith, but it was also their best chance of finally ending the nightmare that had haunted them for so long. "Thank you, Linda," Alexander said, his voice filled with sincerity. "You don't know what this means to us." Linda gave a small nod, her eyes filled with understanding. "I think I do," she said. "Take care of yourselves. And remember, you're not alone in this." With that, Linda left, the journal securely in her bag, and Alexander watched as she disappeared into the distance. He turned back to Raymond and Frank, a sense of calm settling over him. They had done what they needed to do. Now, it was time to trust that the truth would come out. Back at the farmhouse a few weeks later, things were quiet. They had stayed hidden just as Linda had suggested, keeping a low profile while waiting for news. Every day, Alexander would check the newspapers, his heart pounding as he searched for any sign that their story had been published. And then, one morning, there it was. Front-page headlines exposing the corruption, the deceit, the crimes that had been hidden for so long. The men who had chased them, the people who had kept his family apart, were now under investigation. The truth was out, and the world was finally seeing what his father had fought to reveal. Raymond looked up from the newspaper, tears glistening in his eyes. He turned to Alexander, a smile breaking across his face. "We did it, Alex," he whispered, his voice filled with emotion. "We really did it." Alexander felt a wave of relief wash over him, the weight of everything they had been through lifting from his shoulders. He nodded, his own eyes filled with tears. "Dad would be proud," he said quietly. "He fought for this, and now the truth is out." Frank, who was sitting nearby, raised his cup of coffee, his eyes filled with pride. "To Henry," he said, his voice filled with reverence, "and to all of us, for never giving up." Alexander and Raymond raised their cups, their eyes meeting, a sense of unity binding them together. They had faced the darkness, fought for the truth, and now they had won. It hadn't been easy, and there were still challenges ahead, but they had made it through, together. As the morning sun streamed through the windows, bathing the room in warmth, Alexander felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: peace. He knew that the road ahead would still have its ups and downs, that there would be more battles to fight, more challenges to face. But he also knew that they were stronger now, that they were a family, and that they could face anything together. They had come a long way from where they started, strangers separated by secrets, reunited by a mysterious letter. And now, after everything they had been through, they had found each other, fought for each other, and emerged victorious. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, Alexander felt ready to face whatever came next. With Raymond by his side, with Frank's unwavering support, and with the memory of his father guiding him, he knew they could take on anything. They had found the truth, they had found each other, and they had found hope. And that, Alexander realized, was all they really needed. Months had passed since the truth had come to light, since the story of corruption and betrayal had been splashed across newspapers and television screens. The people who had once chased Alexander, who had tried to keep his family apart, were now facing the consequences of their actions. Investigations were ongoing, charges were being filed, and one by one, those responsible were being brought to justice. The farmhouse, which had once been a refuge from the chaos, was now a place of peace and quiet. A place where Alexander, Raymond, and Frank could finally breathe without the constant weight of fear pressing down on them. The world outside had changed, but here in this small corner of the countryside, time seemed to move a little slower, allowing them to savor the moments they had fought so hard to have. Alexander stood by the window, looking out at the fields that stretched out before him, the sun setting in the distance, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. It was a beautiful sight, one that reminded him of all that they had gained. The farmhouse had become more than just a safe house, it had become a home, a place where they could heal, rebuild, and start anew. Raymond walked into the room, a small smile on his face as he approached Alexander. "I just got off the phone with Linda," he said, his voice filled with excitement. "The final charges were filed today. They're not getting away with it this time." Alexander turned to his uncle, his eyes filled with gratitude. "We did it, Ray," he said softly, his voice filled with emotion. "We really did it?" Raymond nodded, his eyes misting over as he looked at his nephew. "Your dad would be so proud of you, Alex," he said, his voice trembling. "He always believed that you would do great things, and you've proven him right." Alexander felt a lump form in his throat, his heart swelling with emotion. He thought of his father, of the sacrifices he had made, the love he had shown, and the courage he had demonstrated in trying to protect his family. Everything he had done had been for them, and now, standing here, Alexander felt that he had finally honored his father's legacy. "Thank you, Ray," Alexander said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I couldn't have done any of this without you, and without Frank. You both stood by me when I needed you most." Raymond smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "We're family, Alex, and that's what family does. We take care of each other." Later that evening, they gathered around the fireplace, the warmth of the flames filling the room. Frank had made dinner, something simple but comforting, and they ate together, sharing stories and laughter. It was a far cry from the tense nights they had once spent here, hiding from the threats that had seemed to lurk around every corner. Now there was a sense of ease, a feeling that they had finally found their place in the world. As they finished their meal, Frank leaned back in his chair, a contented smile on his face. "You know," he said, his voice filled with nostalgia, "this place used to feel so empty. After my kids moved away, it was just me and the memories. But now, it feels alive again. And I have you two to thank for that." Raymond chuckled, his eyes twinkling. "I think we all brought something to the table," he said, his voice light. "And it's been a long time since I felt like I had a real home." Alexander looked at the two men, Frank, who had opened his home and his heart to them, and Raymond, who had never given up hope of finding him. They had both become more than just family. They were his strength, his support, the people who had shown him what it truly meant to belong. "None of this would have happened without Dad," Alexander said softly, his eyes glistening. "He always wanted a better life for us, and I think we've finally given him that." Frank raised his glass, a look of respect in his eyes. "To Henry," he said, his voice steady, "and to the life he fought to give us." Raymond and Alexander raised their glasses as well, their eyes meeting over the flickering firelight. "To Henry," they echoed, their voices filled with love and gratitude. As the days turned into weeks, Alexander began to think about what was next. He had spent so long fighting to find the truth, fighting to protect his family, that he had never really thought about what he wanted for himself. But now, with the chaos behind them, he found himself dreaming of possibilities. He thought about the things that brought him joy, the passions he had once put aside in favor of building his empire. He spent time helping Frank around the farmhouse, repairing fences, tending to the garden, doing things that required patience and care, things that he had never made time for before. He found solace in the simplicity of it, in the way the earth responded to his touch, in the way that life continued to grow and thrive despite everything they had been through. One day, as he and Raymond sat on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, Alexander turned to his uncle, a thoughtful look on his face. "You know, Ray," he said, his voice contemplative, "I've been thinking about staying here. Not forever, maybe, but for a while. I like the quiet. I like feeling like I'm part of something real." Raymond smiled, his eyes filled with understanding. "I think that's a great idea, Alex," he said. "We've been through so much, and I think we deserve a little peace." Alexander nodded, a sense of contentment settling over him. He knew that their journey wasn't over, that there would always be challenges ahead. But he also knew that they were stronger now, that they had each other, and that they could face whatever came their way. For the first time in a long time, Alexander felt hopeful. He had found his family, he had found the truth, and now he was finding himself. It wasn't the life he had planned, but it was the life he wanted, a life filled with love, with purpose, and with the people who mattered most. As the last rays of sunlight disappeared, Alexander leaned back in his chair, a smile on his face. The future was uncertain, but he was ready to face it, together with Raymond, with Frank, and with the memory of his father guiding him. They had found hope in the darkest of times, and now they were finally ready to embrace the light.